You know, you may have noticed in the last few weeks ago that the latest front in the seemingly eternal culture war between conservatives and liberals has centered around something called critical race theory. Several states have moved to ban CRT from classrooms, including my home state of Florida.
Supporters like Governor Ron DeSantis say this new rule is all about teaching the facts of our history, while opponents say it's politicizing classroom instruction.
All in favor say aye.
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 The State Board of Education unanimously passing a new rule, changing how history is taught in public schools. It bans critical race theory, which a UCF professor defines as a, quote, theoretical perspective and practice for examining the role of race and racism in society. Governor Ron DeSantis speaking in favor of the new rule, saying education needs to be grounded in facts.
Some of this stuff is, I think, really toxic. I think it's going to cause a lot of divisions. I think it'll cause people to think of themselves more as a member of a particular race or based on skin color, rather than based on the content of their character and based on their hard work and what they're trying to accomplish in life.
At least 16 states are considering or signed into law bills that limit how schools frame American history. But News 6 learned most school districts in Central Florida don't teach critical race theory.
Now, to the savvy viewer, and I'm sure all of you are very savvy, you'll recognize this is just the latest right-wing straw man. This is the 2021 version of the panic over Sharia law. That being said, the whole debate has opened up a very real problem with how both conservatives and liberals see history, namely the tendency to use history to naturalize phenomena rather than historicize them. This is something that Michael Brooks wrote about eloquently in his book Against the Web, and I think it's worth hearing him discuss what he means by that.
A basic difference, I would say, between left and right is the difference between historicizing and naturalizing. If you're on the left, broadly speaking, you look at things and you say, what are the historical, material reasons why that is happening? If you're on the right, you say that is what it is.
What are the historical, material reasons why that is happening versus it is what it is? The most famous example in recent memory of the reactionary tendency to naturalize something is Jordan Peterson's Consider the Lobster thesis to justify hierarchies in human societies.
So these creatures engage in dominance disputes, and I think dominance is the right way to think about it because lobsters aren't very empathic and they're not very social, and so it really is the toughest lobster that wins. You know, and what's so cool about the lobster is that when a lobster wins, he flexes and gets bigger, so he looks bigger because he's a winner. It's like he's advertising that. And the neurochemical system that makes him flex is serotonergic. And you think, well, who cares? What the hell does that mean? Well, I'll tell you what it means. It's the same chemical that's affected by antidepressants in human beings. And so, like, if you're depressed, you're a defeated lobster. Like, you're like this. I'm small. I'm not, you know, things are dangerous. I don't want to fight. You give someone an antidepressant, it's like up they stretch, and then they're ready to, like, take on the world again. Well, if you give lobsters who just got defeated in a fight serotonin, then they stretch out and they'll fight again. And that's, like, we separated from those creatures on the evolutionary timescale somewhere between 350 and 600 million years ago, and the damn neurochemistry is the same. And so that's another indication of just how important hierarchies of authority are. I mean, they've been conserved since the time of lobsters, right? There weren't trees around when lobsters first manifested themselves on the planet. And so what that means is these hierarchies that I've been talking about, those things are older than trees.
These hierarchies are older than trees, people. Trying to end hierarchies goes against the laws of nature that go back literally hundreds of millions of years. Now, we on the left reject this kind of thing. It is ahistorical to think that society is just nature, that it is what it is because that's the law of nature. You see this kind of thing emerge whenever you try to discuss an alternative to capitalism. Reactionaries will scoff at you and say, what are you talking about? It's just self-evident that capitalism is just the thing. But in the last few years, there's been a new fault line in the debate, and it's that liberals have come to embrace a view of history that naturalizes racism rather than historicizes it. Here's Michael Brooks again.
Now, paradoxically, this is actually a reason why right now there's a lot of conflict between people who are more socialistic and people who are more like woke, quote unquote, because their moral dimension is better. Look, America is a racist society is correct. Acknowledging that truth versus denying that truth is a major difference, no question. However, if you read Adolph Reed, who's one of my intellectual heroes, I really hope everybody is reading him, he will tell you why racism and white supremacy is a multi-generational project in America that depends on economic conditions, that manifests in different geographies, that is inseparable for how we produce and do capitalism. And actually, it might become separable, right? Whereas some people who have a woke discourse, it just is. It's the religious foundation of America. There's no difference between any different historical periods. It's just this moral block statement. Does that make sense?
That's what liberals believe, that racism just is, that it's part of the religious foundation of America. And the biggest proponent of this view of America's history with race, which in many ways inspired this latest round of cultural war over critical race theory, was the New York Times' 1619 Project, led by Nicole Hannah-Jones. In her opening essay for the 1619 Project, Jones writes that, quote, anti-Black racism runs in the very DNA of this country, as does the belief so well articulated by Lincoln that Black people are the obstacle to national unity. Notice Jones's use of the DNA metaphor, a literal biological instruction manual that determines human characteristics. As Matt Karp points out, the 1619 Project contains 7 references to racism being in America's DNA. Now, it's worth noting that one cannot change one's DNA, at least not yet, as far as I know. You're simply stuck with the DNA you got, and you got to live with it. This is a version of Jordan Peterson's lobster meme. Anti-Black racism is just in America's DNA. It just is. It's a law of nature. This naturalizes our history. It is fundamentally a reactionary idea. And often, naturalizing something tends to lead to just bad history. The most controversial claim made in the 1619 Project is that the American Revolution was not motivated by things like taxation without representation, which is the popular explanation, but by the desire on the part of the colonists to keep the institution of slavery intact.
What it has sparked, though, is a fight over history and how the history is told.
Yes.
You know, once this magazine came out, there were many historians who came after you and said, no, this is incorrect. The primary reason that America sought its independence from Britain was not because they wanted to maintain slavery. It was because of taxation without representation. It wasn't the primary cause. Why do you think there's such a resistance to slavery being one of the primary causes of America breaking away from Britain?
Because we need to believe as a country that our founding was pure. That yes, you know, we had some troubles, including holding 500,000 people in bondage, but that largely we were a nation founded to be exceptional and these majestic ideas, and that our founders, though complicated men, were men who were righteous. But when you argue that our founders were, many of them, very hypocritical, and that you can't just simply overlook the fact that slavery was a motivation in some of the colonies. Yes, taxation was a motivation, but also the ability to keep making a lot of money off of human bondage.
Right.
That is very unsettling, not just to the average American, but to historians who have seen their job as protecting that founding narrative.
So according to the 1619 Project, the colonists feared that by the 1770s, Britain was going to outlaw slavery, and thus they needed to break away so that wouldn't happen. This narrative has been challenged by many historians. This is from a friend of the show, Matt Karp's recent piece in Harper's. Matt is a Civil War historian at Princeton. He writes, quote, Wilentz and other critics argued that this fundamentally misrepresented the politics of the revolution. As historians from Eric Williams to Christopher Brown have explained in detail, anti-slavery sentiment in Britain remained marginal in the 1770s. Certainly, it was much weaker in London than in the rebellious colonies, where at least 7 colonial assemblies had already attempted to end the importation of enslaved Africans, and where the Continental Congress would ban the slave trade in 1774. As the scholar Leslie Harris put it bluntly in Politico, the protection of slavery was not one of the main reasons the 13 colonies went to war. Harris, who had been contacted by a Times fact checker to help confirm material in the 1619 Project, wrote that she had vigorously disputed Hannah Jones's incorrect statement and was distressed to see that it had made it into print. Eventually, the Times issued a thin clarification, agreeing to change the phrase "the colonists decided" to "some of the colonists decided," but leaving the rest of the questionable text in place. Now, when you see history through a naturalization lens, you tend to see everything through whatever natural law you've ascribed to it. If you're Jordan Peterson, you'll see everything as a way to perpetuate hierarchies. If you're a lot of modern day liberal scholars, you see everything as a way to perpetuate racism. But what is the alternative to this? Well, yeah, Marxism. As Marxists, we approach culture and history by looking at the means of production. To oversimplify things, a society's culture is its laws, its media, its attitudes, etc., don't just have a life of their own. They are necessarily attached to the economic system that decides who owns what or who has to work for who.
The base superstructure model is a theory for understanding how ownership of the means of production controls society. The base is made up of the means of production, all the things needed to produce something, for example, machines and factories to build a car, and the relations of production, the way in which the bourgeoisie exploits the proletariat. The base shapes the superstructure as the bourgeoisie have the means to produce the news, television and film to reinforce their dominant ideology on the rest of society. This in turn maintains and legitimizes the base, preventing the proletariat from realizing they're being exploited.
Thank you, kind British woman, to the tune of a nice sounding piano. But how does this play out in our analysis of history? Well, take something like mass incarceration. The liberal understanding of mass incarceration, which has become the dominant understanding in our culture, was that it was a way to perpetuate Jim Crow. This was made popular by the book by Michelle Alexander, The New Jim Crow. The basic outline is that there was Jim Crow, and then it was repealed by the civil rights movement, and then there was a backlash to it from white America, and then politicians realized that they could capitalize on that white backlash through law and order politics, which led them to pass a series of laws that targeted black people and threw them into prison on a massive scale as a way to reinstitute Jim Crow, but by a new name. That is the racialized view of what happened. And while it's not like there's no truth in that narrative whatsoever, it leads out several complicating factors. The first of which is that black people overwhelmingly supported a lot of the tough on crime laws that were passed, but also there was a real crime wave that emerged in the middle of the 20th century. This was not something that politicians invented. The question is, why did that crime wave happen? Well, here is how a Marxist scholar looks at that. Let's go back to Adana Usmani from Anna's segment. Notice that he does not deny that race plays a role, but he foregrounds the forces of production. Here he is discussing Crime and Punishment on the Jacobin show.
Why did that happen in the United States at mid-century? I think the short story is that the United States, in effect, is unique amongst advanced capitalist countries in that it industrialized with Europe's peasantry rather than with its own in some important sense. And so what happened, what I think is characteristic of the American labor market over the 20th century, is that African Americans, after sharecropping collapsed in the South, came in effect late to American labor markets and found it very difficult to make inroads into American labor markets as a result of obviously white racism, also as a result of this kind of late arrival, missing basically kind of the industrialization boat. And that's just caused, America has basically failed to replace the jobs for African American males that were lost to the collapse of farming for the duration of the 20th century. And there's just been this persistent problem of massive levels of unemployment in African American communities as a consequence for the 20th century. And it's that, I think, that is at the heart of the problems of the rise in violence and the rise in crime. That's kind of, as we say in the article, that's triggered by certain changes that happen post-war. But I think the core of the problem is this. The core of the problem lies in the labor market, I think, in the United States.
Now, it may seem like a subtle difference, and in many ways it is, but it is a sharper analysis. And the solutions to the problem that flow from that analysis are also much clearer. You get America's black underclass good stable jobs, and that'll improve a lot of this racism that we see in mass incarceration. The solutions to the new Jim Crow are less clear. You have to change the racial attitudes of white people. Now, Adorno's analysis is less paralyzing as well, because if you can alter the makeup of the forces of production, you will change the society. Hillary Clinton was wrong when she said that breaking up the banks won't end racism. Now, to be clear, changing the means of production is a tall ask, but it's at least possible. What you can't do is change nature. You can't change your DNA. And that's probably why a lot of mainstream liberals have so embraced this view of history, because at their core, they don't want anything to fundamentally change, in the immortal words of Joe Biden. That is why there is such a furious rejection towards any view of history that emphasizes change. As Matt Karp writes in Harper's, quote, an older tradition of left-wing American politics had much less trouble with this kind of historical thinking. Frederick Douglass plays little part in the 1619 Project, but he knew better than most that historical narratives matter in political struggles. They shape our sense of the terrain under our feet and the horizon in front of us. They frame our vision of what is possible. Douglass's famous speech about the 4th of July came at a low ebb of the abolitionist movement, just after the Compromise of 1850, which included the Fugitive Slave Act, appeared to remove the question of slavery from national politics for good. That made it all the more important for him to build an argument from history, drawing on the experience of the revolution to insist that the United States belonged not to the timid and the prudent, but to insurgents who preferred revolution to peaceful submission to bondage. Douglass's fight against antebellum timidity took courage and purpose from an understanding of history in which radical change was possible. Moreover, Douglass questioned the wisdom of any historical politics that undermined the prospects for present-day change. This did not imply a purely instrumental contempt for the past in the manner of the Trumpian right, but rather reflected a clear-eyed determination to treat history not as scripture or DNA, but as a site of struggle. But to do with the past only as we can make it useful to the present and to the future, Douglass declared. To all inspiring motives, to noble deeds which can be gained from the past, we are welcome, but now is the time, the important time. For some scholars, this must read like rank presentism. Yet unlike the neo-originalist framing of the 1619 Project, it gets the order of operations right. The past may live inside the present, but it does not govern our growth, however sordid or sublime. Our origins are not our destinies. Our daily journey into the future is not fixed by moral arcs or genetic instructions. Now, today is Juneteenth, which is now a federal holiday, which is great for many reasons, not the least of which means that it's an extra day we get to take off work, but also because it should serve not as a reminder of America's racist DNA, but as an inspiring moment of possibility, of the possibility to overcome the horror of our president or our present and to radically change it.